All right, Tim. So let's talk about this is a new month, and I always want to talk about new things. And obviously, you're on the road, as I can tell right now. You got you got Vegas in the background there, and you're doing some. I think you're at Nellis Air Force Base. Um, let's talk about BAH fraud, and the implications of that. So get me caught up on what's going on this month.
Yeah, BAH fraud has been really big. It's been something we've done a lot of cases on. It's what brought me out here on the road. Right now, I'm at Nellis Air Force Base. You can see the Vegas skyline behind me, at least a bit of it. But we were out in San Diego a couple days ago, out at Miramar, taking care of a staff sergeant on a BAH fraud case. These cases they're prolific. What I mean by prolific, there are a lot of them. We get calls nearly every single month, sometimes every week, on these housing fraud cases. You wouldn't think housing fraud would be that big of a deal in the military, but it is, because it's very easy and enticing for a service member to commit this type of a fraud. And what they realize is that, just getting a couple, maybe $1,000 or some extra money every month, that can turn into, in reality, $250,000 type of a fraud or a larceny, because these things just get not out of control. But if you're getting overpaid, intentionally getting overpaid, and it's month after month after month, it can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's what we had out in San Diego. We had a staff sergeant who, just was, getting entitlements he wasn't entitled to for a period of years, and it just added up to a ton of money. And when they get audited, the audits come down, law enforcement gets notified. They do fairly sophisticated investigations, and most of the times these cases will end up at a general court martial.
What's part of your defense when they have this type of fraud come down on them? Because it seems like to me the evidence is probably overwhelmingly against them, isn't it?
It can be, but the Joint Federal Travel Regulation, the JFTR, is complex, and no one understands this. IPAC doesn't understand it. Your S1 doesn't understand it. Hell, even the people at DFAS barely understand it. And if you've gone to IPAC or gone to your S1 or to finance and had a finance question, you can ask that same question to three different people, and you're almost always going to get three different answers. So the first issue becomes trying to figure out what you are actually entitled to, because sometimes it's not clear. It's not as clear cut as you think it is. If you have a service member, there's a lot of different examples I can give, and we'll go through those in a minute. But first off, it's not always very clear cut. So the first step is to just do an audit. And what we like to do is we like to retain the services of an expert in that area. Oftentimes they can be a military service member, someone that works at DFAS, or a civilian who has a lot of experience, and we will have them do a complete audit of the account, because you may have a dependent in one location, a spouse in another location, maybe a spouse that went from New York, then back down to Lejeune, and then back to New York. So you don't know where the hell you're entitled to pay. So step one is determine what you're actually entitled to and what BAH, or basic allowance for housing, or OHA, that you actually rate, and then look at that against what you actually claimed or thought you were entitled to. That's the first step. And doing that first step, oftentimes, a lot of these cases, you realize that the government may say you have a $150,000 fraud, but you may actually only have a $20,000 and overpayment. And there's a difference between an overpayment and a fraud. If it's a larceny, an Article 121 offense, it's specific intent. You have to specifically intend to defraud the government. And that's a hell of a lot different than getting overpaid because you were a corporal, it's your first time being married, and IPAC got something wrong, or S1 got something wrong, or you didn't know the location of your spouse. So step one is to really do the audit to make sure what your entitlements are, what you got paid, and determine if there is an issue of specific intent, if that service member actually intended to defraud the government, or if there was an overpayment or something else. That's really step one, and that's really going to drive the next steps, because if you have something where it was an overpayment, or you have maybe negligence as opposed to something criminal, then we can go back and work with the government and oftentimes get those charges lowered, or perhaps even get them dismissed. Oftentimes if the service member is able to pay the funds back. On other occasions you have where it's clearly fraud. I mean, you have other occasions where it just clearly is, where you have a service member who claims their spouse lives in New York City, but the only time they've ever seen New York City is on an old school Jay-Z video, right? They've never actually been there. We've had service members who have a foreign spouse, and they'll claim New York City, San Francisco, Honolulu, and their spouses never even stepped foot in America. In those cases, then we're looking at it from a different perspective. Part of it's, can the government prove the case? Because just because someone's, quote, guilty of it doesn't mean that they're going to be found guilty of it. So does the government have the evidence to prove the case? You'd think they would, but not always, because these cases are fairly complex in terms of the documentation and the paperwork that needs to be done. And if the government can prove the case, then it's often an issue of damage limitation, which is what we did out in San Diego. We had extraordinary damage mitigation or limitation. That's what we did out there. So there's a lot of different scenarios, but it starts with that audit to determine what the hell we're actually looking at to begin with. If you're involved in BAH fraud, you need to call my office immediately and do a consultation. You can reach us at area code 813-669-3500. Please get on my calendar. We'll schedule a full evaluation of your case. It will be in complete confidence, and we'll come up with a plan for how to deal with your situation.